Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist and pioneer of depth psychology, understood something that modern treatments often forget. Addiction is not the disease, it is the symptom. A symptom of spiritual dislocation, of psychic fragmentation, of an inner life that has grown quiet, starved of meaning. In Jung's view, the addict is not merely chemically dependent, he is metaphysically lost. The bottle, the binge, the scroll, they are not the real problem. They are placeholders. They are the soul's cry for reunion, for wholeness, for a return to the forgotten self. And so before we reach for the label or the punishment or the quick fix, we must ask, what is this craving truly pointing toward? Addiction in its essence is not about pleasure, it's about pain. Or more precisely, the evasion of pain. The pain of not knowing who we are, the pain of severed purpose, the pain of becoming strangers to our own inner lives. Jung referred to this as disconnection from the self, not the ego, not the social role, but the deep archetypal core within each person. It is from this self that true vitality flows. When we lose contact with it, life becomes flat, dull, and gray. We seek to escape, not because we are weak, but because the world has grown cold without meaning. There is a subtle tragedy at the heart of modern life, one we often overlook because it doesn't always scream. It whispers. It whispers through fatigue that doesn't rest with sleep, through joyless routines disguised as productivity, through cravings that promise fulfillment, but deliver only echoes. This Carl Jung would say is the soul's quiet cry, an expression of our disconnection from the self. Addiction in its most insidious form is not simply about substances or behaviors, it is about loss, the loss of intimacy with one's inner world, the loss of sacred meaning, the loss of the symbolic connection to the greater whole. Jung understood what so many modern interventions miss. Addiction is not the beginning of dysfunction, it is the culmination of a deeper spiritual fracture. Let us be clear. You do not scroll endlessly, binge compulsively, or chase attention because you are broken. You do so because something within you has gone unheard for too long. A part of you, vital and buried, aches for expression. But instead of expression, it finds substitution. Junk food in place of nourishment. Entertainment in place of purpose. Fleeting attention in place of enduring connection. And this substitution, repeated enough times, becomes habit. Habit becomes ritual. And ritual becomes the cage. Jung called this phenomenon psychic splitting. It is the moment in life, usually early and quietly, when we decide often without knowing that certain parts of ourselves are unacceptable. Perhaps your anger was scolded, your sadness ignored, your creativity dismissed. In those formative moments, the psyche begins to fracture. One self is presented to the world, another is buried. The authentic self retreats underground, and in its place grows the mask, the persona. But the unconscious is not idle. What we repress does not disappear. It transforms, and often it transforms into addiction, not merely to a substance, but to anything that numbs the dissonance between who we are and who we pretend to be. The root of addiction, Jung believed, is not chemical dependency. It is spiritual thirst. The human being is not merely a biological organism, but a meaning-seeking vessel. We are driven not just by instinct, but by archetype deep patterns that shape our behavior, our longing, our fears. And when we are disconnected from these archetypes, when the inner child is silenced, when the inner healer is forgotten, when the lover, the creator, the seeker are exiled, the soul revolts. Addiction is that revolt. It is the soul saying, "This life is not whole. And let us not confuse wholeness with perfection. Wholeness in Jungian psychology is not the achievement of flawlessness, but the integration of opposites: light and shadow, joy and grief, desire and discipline. The journey of healing is not about becoming pure, it is about becoming real. You may ask, what does this have to do with dopamine everything? Dopamine is not evil. It is the messenger of motivation, the chemical that moves us toward what we believe will bring relief or pleasure. But in a culture saturated with stimulation and starved of meaning, dopamine becomes misdirected. We chase the next notification, the next purchase, the next hit of novelty, not because we are greedy, but because we are empty. And the emptiness does not originate in biology, it originates in disconnection. Disconnection from the self, disconnection from the symbolic, disconnection from our own truth. Jung would say, you do not heal by resisting the addiction. You heal by listening to what it's trying to tell you. Let us explore that. What is your addiction trying to communicate? Maybe it's pointing to the grief you never fully grieved. Maybe it's screaming about the boundaries you never learned to set. Maybe it's aching for the love you learned to live without. Or maybe it is the shadow calling you back. The part of you that still remembers who you were before the mask. Before the world told you what parts of yourself were welcome and which were too much. You see, Jung didn't believe in suppression. He believed in integration. That the very parts of us we exile are the ones that carry the keys to our wholeness. The rage you were told to hide may contain your boundaries. The sorrow you were taught to silence may contain your empathy. The craving you thought was shameful may contain your lost passion. So the question is not how do I get rid of my addiction? The question is, what is my addiction trying to restore? This is the pivot point. When you begin to see your addiction not as a personal failure, but as a symbolic flare from the unconscious, everything changes. You are no longer a patient to be fixed. You are a seeker on the path to integration. In Jung's vision, healing does not come from willpower. It comes from awareness. It comes from dialogue with the unconscious, from the courage to turn inward and ask, what have I abandoned in order to survive? And here's what's remarkable: when you make that turn, when you begin to listen instead of fight, something ancient and beautiful begins to stir. The self long exiled begins to re-emerge, and with it comes a sense of meaning not sourced from consumption, but from connection. Not from stimulation, but from soul. This is not an easy journey, but it is a worthy one. And the first step is not perfection. It is presence, not fixing, but facing. So before we move on to the practical tools, Jung inspired, the rituals, the breath, the shadow work, ask yourself, what if this addiction isn't your enemy? What if it's your guide? Because maybe the part of you that's been trying to escape is also the part of you that's ready to return home. There's a part of you that lives behind the mask, a hidden realm within, filled not only with your wounds, but with your deepest truths. Jung called this the shadow, a term not meant to frighten, but to awaken. For in the shadow live not only your fears, but your lost vitality. Not only your pain, but your power. And if we are ever to heal the roots of addiction, we must learn to turn toward the very thing we've spent a lifetime avoiding. The shadow is not evil. It is repressed energy. The parts of ourselves we were taught were too angry, too sensitive, too needy, too loud. These were not destroyed. They were pushed out of awareness, buried beneath layers of adaptation. You became the strong one, the smart one, the reliable one, but at what cost? The child who wanted to scream was silenced. The adolescent who wanted to be free was scolded. The adult who longed to feel deeply was told to get over it. And so a split occurs. Jung named this the disintegration of the personality, a slow and silent fragmentation of the inner world. One part of you lives on the surface, functional, appropriate, acceptable. The other part lives underground, holding everything you weren't allowed to feel. Over time, that buried part becomes the source of unconscious tension. And tension, when ignored, becomes behavior often compulsive, sometimes destructive. Addiction, then, is not random. It is ritualized avoidance, a psychological detour around the very emotions that demand our attention. Here is the paradox. What we reject in ourselves doesn't go away. It takes the wheel. The anger we suppress leaks out in irritability. The shame we carry manifests as self-sabotage. The grief we never grieve numbs us until we forget how to feel anything at all. The psyche left unheard doesn't whisper forever. It begins to shout, and addiction becomes its megaphone. But Jung offered an alternative to confront the shadow, not with condemnation, but with curiosity. To ask, what in me is unwelcomed? What part of me have I locked away thinking it would make me lovable or safe? This is the work of integration, and it begins with acknowledgement. One of Jung's most famous statements reminds us, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. This is the tragedy of the unaware life, repeating patterns, reliving wounds, confusing pain for identity. But the moment we turn the light inward even slightly, the spell begins to break. Let us take a practical step into that space. If your addiction had a voice, what would it say? Not the critical voice, not the shame, but the part of you beneath the behavior. What would it ask for? What would it confess? Try this. Take a journal and ask, what is my addiction protecting me from? Don't edit. Don't fix. Just write. This is shadow work in its simplest form, not analysis, but intimacy. A sacred act of witnessing the exiled self. For many, what emerges is not monstrous, but mournful. Loneliness, unheard pain, longing for recognition. You may find that what your shadow holds is not darkness at all, but the parts of you that were once light before they were judged. Jung believed that the unconscious is not just a reservoir of repressed material, it is a gateway to transformation. And in addiction, we find a map. Because the places where we lose ourselves most desperately are often the places where the soul is trying to return. Let us not mistake suppression for strength. Real strength is facing the mirror and staying present. Real healing is not about killing the shadow. It's about making space for it to sit at the table of your awareness. Because only then does it stop screaming. This is not easy work. It will bring discomfort. It will challenge your old identities. It may bring up tears long held back or truths long denied. But this is the very doorway to freedom. The beauty of the shadow is this: when it is seen, it no longer controls. When it is spoken, it no longer sabotages. When it is welcomed, it transforms. The person who emerges from shadow work is not someone new, but someone truer, more whole, more real. Because you are no longer running from pieces of yourself. You are weaving them together. You may be wondering, how does this stop the craving? It doesn't, not directly. but it transforms your relationship to the craving. Instead of reacting in shame or escape, you begin to recognize the craving as a signal. Not to binge, but to listen. Not to numb, but to feel. And in that moment of recognition, you shift from unconscious repetition to conscious choice. That is the pivot point. That is power. And over time, the cravings lessen. Not because you've suppressed them, but because you've answered them. Not with distraction, but with depth. You begin to crave meaning more than escape. You begin to long for truth more than relief. And slowly, the loop breaks, not because you've fought it, but because you've understood it. This is what Jung meant by individuation, the process of becoming whole by reclaiming the parts you once abandoned. Addiction brought you to the edge. The shadow waits on the other side. But if you step forward not with judgment, but with reverence, you will not find a monster. You will find yourself. To face the shadow is a sacred act. But to integrate it, to bring it into the light, and give it a place within, is where the deeper transformation begins. Carl Jung believed that symbols, rituals, and embodied practices weren't accessories to healing. They were the language of the soul. For it is not the rational mind alone that heals the wound. It is the deeper self, the self with a capital S, that must be engaged, and it speaks not in analysis, but in images, in breath, and in presence. So the question is not simply, how do I stop the addiction? The more precise and transformative question is, how do I live in a way that no longer requires it? The answer lies in practices, not prescriptions. Practices that nourish the spirit and reawaken the parts of you that addiction once tried to replace. These are not meant to cure you. They are meant to reconnect you with your emotions, your body, your unconscious, and your soul. Let us begin with the first shadow work. You may recall that the shadow is not your enemy, but the repository of everything you were once told was unacceptable. To engage the shadow is to extend a hand to your disowned self. It is a conscious and continuous dialogue with your inner world, and it begins not in grand gestures, but in quiet reflection. Set aside time, perhaps 15 minutes a day, to journal with honesty. Ask the questions that scare you. What part of myself do I hide from others? What part of me have I rejected because someone else did? If my addiction had a voice, what would it say to me? Write without censure. This is not a performance, it is a reckoning. You may cry. You may feel anger rise. You may uncover desires or wounds you thought you buried long ago. Good. That is the energy returning to consciousness. Jung taught that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. In other words, you must go to the place where the pain lives, not to dwell, but to retrieve the part of you that still lives there. The second practice is one Jung didn't formally teach, but would have understood deeply: breath work. Breath is the only function in the body that is both voluntary and involuntary. It belongs to both the conscious and unconscious realms, a bridge between two worlds. In Jungian terms, this is a symbolic act of reconnection. By breathing intentionally, you bypass the ego and access the deeper psychic layers where emotion, memory, and energy are stored. Start simply. Find a quiet space. Sit or lie down. Inhale deeply through your nose for a count of 4. Hold for 4. Exhale through your mouth for a count of 6. Repeat. Let the breath guide you not forcefully, but with compassion. Some days you may feel peace. Other days unresolved emotion may surface. Tears, trembling warmth, visions. These are not signs of breakdown. They are signs of release. You are opening the vault of the unconscious, not to be overwhelmed, but to be realigned. You are clearing space where numbness once lived. As Jung might say, the psyche will always find a way to express itself. The question is, will you listen? Breath work is one way to say yes to create a listening space within the body. The third practice is ancient and sacred symbolic ritual. Jung wrote often about the soul's relationship with imagery and symbol. He saw dreams not as nonsense, but as messages. He saw rituals not as superstition, but as dialogues with the unconscious. We live in a world that has forgotten the power of sacred acts, but your soul has not forgotten. It still longs for a symbolic container where it can feel seen, heard, and held. Try this. Find a quiet space at dusk or dawn, liminal hours when the veil is thin. Light a single candle. Sit in front of a mirror and gaze softly into your own eyes, not to critique, but to witness. Speak aloud a truth you've been avoiding. Something like, I know I've been running. I know I've used this addiction to fill a silence I didn't understand. But I'm listening now. I am ready to meet the part of me I left behind. Then write a letter not to your addiction, but to yourself. The self that remembers. The self that survived. The self that is trying to re-emerge. Fold the letter and place it beneath the candle. Let it sit there as a symbol that your healing has a witness you. This is not a fix. It is a covenant. A rebinding of the soul to the body, the conscious to the unconscious, the outer life to the inner one. Why do these practices matter? Because addiction numbs. These tools reveal. Addiction splits the psyche. These tools reintegrate. Addiction silences the soul. These tools listen. And over time, with consistency and care, these practices become more than exercises. They become doorways, not out of yourself, but back into yourself. You begin to trust your own inner guidance. You begin to feel your own emotions without fleeing. You begin to see the craving not as an enemy, but as a message. And when the message is heard, the need for the messenger begins to fade. This is how the soul heals, not through force, but through attention. Not through willpower, but through presence. And this presence practiced daily becomes the light that guides you home. To heal is not to return to who you were before the pain, but to become someone deeper because of it. Carl Jung did not teach that transformation came from resisting darkness. Rather, he taught that we must descend into the depths of our unconscious to recover what was lost. And when we emerge scarred, perhaps, but whole, we begin to build a life that no longer requires escape. What does this look like? How does one design a life that is aligned with the soul rather than the shadow? It begins not with grand change, but with subtle reorientation. A shift in the compass from external stimulation to internal resonance. From asking, what do I need to feel better, to asking, what part of me needs to be seen. Let us explore this through 3 movements: redesigning your reality, restoring meaning, and reinterpreting relapse. 1. Redesigning your reality. Living in alignment with the self. Jung warned of a life not lived. Neurosis, he believed, often stemmed not from pathology, but from spiritual stagnation, from days that look productive on the surface, but offer no nourishment to the soul. Many people suffering from addiction are not sick, they are starving. Starving for meaning, for beauty, for truth. Look at your current life. Ask, what feeds the addiction and what feeds my authenticity? The job that drains you, the social circle that demands your mask, the routines that numb instead of renew, these are not neutral. They either support the self or suppress it. Begin small. One honest conversation. One creative outlet. One boundary you've long avoided. These are not merely lifestyle upgrades. They are psychic reclamations, acts of realignment with your core. You don't need a total reinvention. You need sacred congruence, where your outer world begins to reflect your inner one. Where your home, your relationships, your calendar become extensions of your soul, not escapes from it. When your reality honors your truth, the compulsion to flee it diminishes. 2. Restoring meaning. Replacing dopamine loops with soulful engagement. The modern world floods us with dopamine, but deprives us of meaning. Jung would not have been surprised. He believed that man's most pressing need was not pleasure, but purpose. Without it, we fall prey to stimulation without substance. The endless scroll, the shopping binge, the mindless consumption, they are not evil. But they are signals. Signals that the soul has been ignored. Signals that the symbolic life, the life of depth, of ritual, of beauty, has been abandoned. To heal from addiction is not to remove these behaviors through force. It is to render them obsolete by replacing them with what the psyche actually needs: engagement with meaning. Ask yourself, when was the last time I created something instead of consumed? When did I last sit in silence and ask, what am I really feeling? Who in my life makes space for my truth, not just small talk, but sacred conversation? Begin building meaning loops instead of dopamine loops. Paint, even if you think you can't. Read something that stirs you, not just entertains. Practice stillness, even if it makes you uncomfortable. These are not indulgences, they are acts of return. Over time, the nervous system settles. The cravings soften, not because you've deprived yourself, but because you've fed yourself deeply and truly. 3. Reinterpreting relapse. A spiral, not a failure. Finally, we must speak to relapse not as shame, but as signal. Jung was adamant: the unconscious does not move in straight lines. It spirals, it returns, it deepens. Healing is not linear progress, it is circular integration. If you return to the old habit, it does not mean you are back at the beginning. It means you've reached a layer you weren't ready for last time. And now, with new tools, new awareness, and a new language, you can face it differently. Relapse is the psyche saying, there's something here you missed. Let's look again. The work then is not to collapse into guilt, but to enter the moment with curiosity. Ask, what triggered this return? What feeling was I trying to avoid? What part of me still feels unsafe or unseen? And then, bring that part into the light. Offer it compassion, not punishment. You are not back at square one. You are deeper in the spiral, and deeper means closer to truth. When we shift our understanding of relapse, we remove the power of shame. And shame, perhaps more than anything else, is what binds addiction to identity. You are not your relapse. You are the one watching it now with awareness, and that is healing in motion. The path forward. This is the heart of Jung's psychology, not recovery, but individuation. The becoming of the self through the integration of what was lost. Addiction then becomes not the curse, but the clue. The thing that cracked you open enough to begin listening. And as you redesign your life, restore meaning, and reinterpret your setbacks, you begin to walk a new path. A path not dictated by compulsion, but guided by soul. A path where your cravings evolve into questions, where your pain becomes poetry, where your past becomes raw material for your becoming. You are not here to be fixed. You are here to return to yourself, not the self the world demanded, but the one you left behind. And now you're ready to welcome them home. There comes a moment, often quiet and unannounced, when you realize that the very thing you feared, your addiction, your craving, your collapse, was never your enemy. It was your invitation. The call from deep within, echoing through every scroll, every sip, every silence you tried to outrun. It did not come to punish you. It came to awaken you. Carl Jung taught that the path to healing is not paved with resistance, but with recognition. Not through battling our darkness, but through embracing it as part of the whole. For the shadow is not a mistake, it is the part of you that has waited patiently to be welcomed home. And now you stand at the threshold of that return. You've journeyed through the origins of addiction not as chemical malfunction, but as spiritual exile. You've seen how the self is split when we learn to perform instead of feel, to numb instead of listen. You've looked at how dopamine, long misunderstood, isn't the villain, it's the signal. It whispers, there is something missing here, something sacred. But what you were truly missing was never a substance. It was never a screen or a scroll. It was never applause, escape, or approval. What you've been missing is you. Through shadow work, you begin to hear the voice beneath the behavior. Through breath work, you learn to access the body's wisdom where emotion lives and where release begins. Through symbolic ritual, you give the unconscious what it craves most: acknowledgement. The soul does not want noise. It wants reverence. This is not a prescription. It's a path. And like all sacred journeys, it will wind, it will spiral, it will test you. You will forget. You will relapse not into sin, but into a lesson unlearned. But this time, you won't spiral blindly. You'll spiral with awareness. You are no longer the person who numbs unconsciously. You are the one who watches with compassion. That is the pivot point between pain and purpose. The goal here is not perfection. Jung would say that perfection is a tyrant of the ego. The goal is integration, to gather your parts, even the broken ones, and make them holy again. Because you are not broken. You are becoming, and this is what we must remember. Healing is not a destination. It is a rhythm. It is not about who you were before the wound. It is about who you become because of it. You are not returning to some lost, innocent version of yourself. You are forging something entirely new, a self that knows how to hold both light and shadow without shame. This Jung called individuation, the becoming of your full, radiant, unfragmented self. So if anything in this journey has stirred something in you, an insight, a memory, a sense of quiet recognition, honor it. That is your unconscious speaking. Listen. Follow it. Let it guide you inward, not to escape the world, but to meet it with new eyes. And before you go, we invite you to do something bold. Comment below with the words, "I'm coming home." Not for us, but for you. Declare it. Affirm it. Mark this moment as the beginning of your return. And if this video resonated with your inner journey, if you're someone who seeks meaning beyond surface answers, who senses there's more to life than what we're sold, then subscribe my channel. This channel is not here to give you more noise. It's here to help you remember what you already know. The journey continues, and you're not alone on the path. You've met your shadow. You've heard your soul, and now you're ready to walk toward wholeness with intention, with reverence, with truth. Welcome home.